Okay, we're now live.
Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us at Policing at a Crossroads, Nigeria and the United States of America. This is a webinar, which means that all of you are muted. You have available to you the option of asking questions in the question box. But at the moment, this event is going to be recorded so that we can capture what promises to be a very rich discussion. So recently, mass protests in Nigeria against widespread police brutality committed by the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, or SARS, were forcefully repressed by the government, resulting in at least 12 deaths, with several injured as of the 20th of October in Lagos, Nigeria, the epicenter of the protests. The End SARS movement in Nigeria in many ways parallels the goals of the Black Lives Matters movement in the United States. There is no finer place than John Jay College to have this discussion looking at this particularly rich moment in international criminal justice. This event is co-sponsored by the International Criminal Justice BA and MA programs, the ICJ Club, and is part of the ICJ Major's 20th anniversary events. The event is co-sponsored by the CLEEN Foundation in Abuja, which is a wonderful organization that I'll speak a little bit more about later on, whose mission is about promoting public safety, security, and accessible justice through the strategies of empirical research, legislative advocacy, demonstration programs, and publications in partnership with government, civil society, and the private sector. This event is also co-sponsored by the ACLU, the Office for the Advancement of Research, John Jay's Departments of Sociology, Political Science, Law, Police Science, and Criminal Justice Administration, the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies, Africana, the Center for Student Involvement and Leadership, and John Jay Center for Human Rights. In case I haven't said it already, my name is Dara Byrd. I'm the Associate Provost for Undergraduate Research and Dean of Undergraduate Studies, and I welcome you to this event. Right now, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel Friedman from the Office of Advancement of Research, who's going to play a video to give you some context of the End SARS movement. Rachel?
Thank you so much, Dara. I'm just going to share my screen with everyone.
Nigeria hasn't had anti-government protests on this scale in years. The protesters initially called for one thing: an end to the special police unit known as SARS, or Special Anti-Robbery Squad. Since it was set up in 1992, the SARS unit has earned a reputation for allegedly abusing, torturing, and killing civilians. Amnesty International reported cases of torture, ill treatment, and extrajudicial killings by the group. Nigerian authorities told CNN that all complaints against its officers will be carefully investigated. The SARS unit was eventually disbanded in October by Mohammed Adamu, Nigeria's Inspector General of Police.
The Special Anti-Robbery Squad of the Nigerian Police, otherwise known as SARS, is hereby dissolved.
It was the fourth time in as many years the unit had been dissolved. In its place, a new unit was formed called SWAT, or Special Weapons and Tactics Team. But the rallies continued, with many protesters breaking curfews. Protesters want wider police reforms, including better compensation for the officers. Amnesty International says Nigerian police opened fire on thousands of people in a matter of hours during the protests. and that at least 12 people died in 2 separate locations involving the military on October 20. The Nigerian army has dismissed outright those numbers. President Muhammadu Buhari announced new reform measures on October 12th. The physical protests have ended, but the group vows to continue online. Many of the protesters say they have received multiple phone calls from unknown sources threatening them. International celebrities and politicians are lending their support to the protesters, but the situation in Nigeria remains very much in a state of flux.
In John Grisham's #1 New York Times bestseller, There Is a Time to Kill.
Sorry about that. Back to you.
Thank you for sharing. Okay, that should give you a little bit of a context about End SARS that each of our distinguished guests will be discussing today. I'm just going to take a moment to tell you a little bit about each of our guests, and you guys are in for a real treat today because our panelists are just leading experts on the topic in front of us. First we have, and this is in an alphabetical order, first we have Gloria Browne-Marshall, a professor of constitutional law at John Jay. She teaches classes on constitutional law, race and the law, evidence, and gender and justice. Professor Browne-Marshall is a prolific author of many articles and several books, including The Voting Rights War, the NAACP and the Ongoing Struggle for Justice, and Race, Law, and American Society, 1607 to present, which includes chapters on race and education, voting rights, criminal justice, property, civil liberties, and protest, the military, and internationalism concerning African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and Native Americans. Her most recently published book is titled She Took Justice, about Black women and the law from warrior Queen Nzinga to today's activists. She is working on a documentary film entitled She Took Justice to accompany the book. Jamil Dakwar is the director of the American Civil Liberties Union's Human Rights Program, which is dedicated to holding the US government accountable to its international human rights obligations and commitments. He leads a team of lawyers and advocates who use a human rights framework to complement existing ACLU legal and legislative advocacy, primarily in areas such as counterterrorism, racial justice, immigrants' rights, women's rights, and criminal and juvenile justice. He's a graduate of Tel Aviv University and NYU School of Law. And we are very lucky because he is also a faculty member at John Jay, where he teaches a course on counterterrorism and human rights. Next, we have Ajim DK, who is a human rights advocate with 20 years of experience in the field and an expert in engaging grassroots communities globally in using human rights mechanisms to advance justice and accountability. Ajim's expertise is in international human rights law, racial justice, gender equality, as well as government accountability and leadership development, and is a thought leader who has guest lectured at many of the country's most distinguished colleges, along with the State Department and the United Nations. Ajim currently works to advise groups on gender, racial, and LGBTQ justice, as well as organizational development. A former chief executive officer of a national human rights organization, I'm thrilled to hear that Ajim will be on the faculty at John Jay this spring, teaching a course on Black women safety for the International Criminal Justice major. Next, Shyvana Newsom, the co-founder of Black Lives Matter Greater New York, is a civil rights leader at the forefront of the new civil rights movement and a former financial advisor at New York Life. She has dedicated her adult life to the betterment of her community and our nation as a whole. In fact, this kind of activism runs in her family. Over the past few years, Shavonna has worked tirelessly leading protests and seeking justice for the families of police brutality, families impacted by police brutality. She works with members of the LGBT community, victims of human rights trafficking, the mental health community, women's reproductive rights organizations, and housing justice advocates. She co-founded Black Lives Caucus, lectured students, and expanded Black Lives Matter Greater New York to multiple New York City charter schools. She is also the producer of Black Lives Matter with Chivona on WBAI 99.5. Benson Chinedu Olugbuo is joining us from Abuja, Nigeria, where he is the executive director of CLEEN Foundation, one of the co-sponsors and partners of this event. He holds a PhD in public law from the University of Cape Town, South Africa. He is a solicitor and advocate of the Supreme Court of Nigeria with more than 15 years of post-call experience on international criminal justice. He was a Fox International Fellow and visiting assistant in research at the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale University from 2011 to 2012. And the Anglophone Africa coordinator for the NGO Coalition for the International Criminal Court. He has published widely on justice sector reform, international criminal justice, and human rights in Africa. I just want to make a note about our partner for this event, CLEEN, of which Dr. Olugbuo is the executive director. CLEEN is an award-winning organization and has been sponsored by many notable foundations such as MacArthur, Open Society, Ford Foundation, and so on. And last but certainly not least of our distinguished panelists, we have Christelle Onwu, who is a lead advisor for African communities at the New York City Commission on Human Rights. She's a 2017 graduate of the Coro Immigrant Civic Leadership Program, the ICLP, and serves as an adjunct professor, so she's also on faculty at John Jay, where she teaches a course on justice in the Africana world in the Africana Studies Department. She's a fierce advocate for the underserved populations with a focus on African communities in New York City. And in her role at the commission, Christelle advocates and mobilizes the African community throughout the 5 boroughs and has given an unprecedented voice to the fastest growing immigrant group in New York City, while also championing the causes of other communities. I would be remiss without mentioning that Christelle is a graduate of John Jay College, and she also received her master's degree in social work from Columbia. Welcome to all of our panelists. I'm now going to turn it over to you so that you have a couple of minutes, about 5 minutes each, to speak before we move on to asking a series of questions, round robin style questions of each of you to get the discussion going. Those who are attending, please know that after the conversation with the panelists, you will also have a chance to ask any questions. Please leave your questions in the Q&A box so that we can get to them as soon as our panelists have finished speaking. Okay, Professor Browne-Marshall, would you like to start us off?
Thank you so much, Dara. I want to start, if I might, to spend my 5 minutes in discussing what we believe is the core problem in the United States with policing. And I begin this, if I might, in 5 minutes, go over 400 years of history. And why this is important is because last year was the 400th commemoration of the arrival of Africans in the Virginia colony. That was in 1619, August of 1619. And what we've had since that arrival of those 20 and odd Africans into that colony that had just been founded in 1607 by King James of England is a mixture of law and violence. that has been allowed to occur based on the lack of enforcement of laws to protect people of African descent and other people of color, but also the lack of prosecution of those people who harm African American and take African American lives and others of color, as well as a legal basis upon which, even if when we bring these issues to the attention of the country and the world, the law itself has a standard so low that it allows the continued murders with impunity of people of African descent that began over 400 years ago and continues to this day. And let me be more specific. The judicial aspect of this is such that the laws were stated based on the Bible, this biblical sense that people of African descent did not have souls, that they were not protected by God, and therefore they were outside of the protection of the legal body and of the group politic. And so in 1619, in July, we had the creation of the legislative body in the Virginia colony. And the Virginia colony is considered as a cornerstone of American history, as where this country began in 1607. And so in 1619 in July, we had the creation of the House of Burgesses, the legislative body made up of landowners. And then in August of 1619, the arrival of 20 Africans, as stated in the journal kept by the secretary of the colony at the time, John Rolfe, indicating that those Africans had arrived in August of 1619, and they had arrived from Angola, Africa. And so we now have no legal basis for slavery, but we had greed as the cornerstone. And this greed meant that those landholders wanted perpetual labor. They wanted those people to work the land, give their intellectual as well as physical contribution to the colony without asking for any full citizenship in return. That was what the law had in mind for the African. And in every term, they would make sure they would undermine the progress of those Africans, and they did progress. In the 1600s, there were Africans who owned land of their own, who had servants of their own, European and African servants of their own. And this so bristled and bridled those Europeans in the colony that they decided to create laws to undermine the economic progress. But of course, people rise up. So they took away their legislative voice and took away the points of law, and as far as the African could have laws of protection of their own. And at the same time, they used criminal justice and criminal injustice, I should say, to undermine the effective advocacy of the African to protect their rights, to protect their families. And here is what I say more specifically. By 1669, they have passed a law ruling any European killing an African would not be fined with a felony. It was not a felony to kill an African as early as 1669. So by the time we get to 1680, they have taken away the right of the African of self-defense by law. And that's why I say what we're looking at with police brutality is the fact that by law and by violence, there is a failure to protect and a failure to prosecute. And so when we go forward with time and slavery ends, the war against the African as far as enslavement ends in 1865, what did they do? They say in our Constitution, 13th Amendment, that slavery is abolished except as punishment for a crime. So now it triggers the criminal justice system to act upon the free African in ways in which they are brutal and horrifying. We have over 5,000 people of African descent recorded, lynched in this country, burned alive, hanged, mutilated. All of these things are happening. Once again, I ask the question, where is law enforcement's protection? Where is the protection of the prosecutor's office to bring actions against the law enforcement and bring actions against the private citizens who are perpetrating these acts? As we go forward, the African never did during slavery, never did after slavery, stand back and allow this to happen. There was always protests. And there were always uprisings, and they continue to happen throughout the history of America. And so by the time we get to our immediate situation, we have to say, here's the core of the American schizophrenia. On the one hand, we tell the world that this is the place of democracy, of the highest order of liberty, the shining light on the hill. Yet at the other hand, we have been an active country in the undermining of the rights and democracy of people of African descent. their right to vote, their right to live peaceably. But here's the other question here. We've also had the pushback always by those people who are non-African, who have stood up, who have decided that they are going to stand up for justice. So we've had desegregation of the military. We've had a military in which they have said early on that we cannot have racial discrimination. We have had the Voting Rights Act in 1965 saying that we cannot have these rulesless people coming forward each time the African votes to deprive the African of their life and liberty. We have had the Civil Rights Act of 1964 stating that all people of color should be given equal and just rights under law. We've had the Fair Housing Act in 1968, in which we've said that housing must be fair and equal to all. We've had the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which says that there has to be equal and full employment for all. And has it been just a miracle? No, it hasn't. There's been legislation and litigation throughout of all this time, but we've never had any national reform for policing. Each jurisdiction, and we have 18,000 police jurisdictions in this country, we have not had any national reform for policing. It is the only major area in that we have still the same mentality of the core of policing, which began as slave catchers, did not prosecute, did not protect. And so we must have national reform for policing, national, not piecemeal reform, because people will continue to rise up and have the same type of protests we've had today, because policing still has it as its core. The people of color are the enemy of some sort, and those other people need to be protected from us by any means necessary. And the legal standard is reasonable force. What is reasonable? There are so few cases that are being brought in which police officers are actually charged with a crime. So we have to have national reform of policing, but also national reform of the prosecutors who are supposed to be prosecuting these police officers. And until that happens, we will continue to have the murder of people of color, and in particular African Americans, and we'll continue to have protests, and we'll continue to have police officers who believe there's no consequence for those lives taken.
Thank you so much, Professor Browne-Marshall. Next, we have Dr. Olugbuo, who's going to, from CLEEN Foundation. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, and thank you, my co-panelists, and thank you all the participants. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are watching from. Our own story doesn't get to the 1620s and 1640s. Our story actually starts around 1943, when the Police Act was passed by the colonial government, that colonized Nigeria. And the plan, of course, was to subdue the natives. And so the police force we had then, before Nigeria became independent in 1960, was actually that of subjugation, that of them against us, and also to ensure that the natives don't exercise their rights to freedom or agitation for independence. It might interest you to note that that psychology has not changed a lot. In fact, it's only this year, 2020, that we formally repealed and enacted a Nigerian Police Force Act 2020. So invariably, since 1943, just before independence, the law we have been using in Nigeria is that was bequeathed to us by colonial masters. Of course, I will acknowledge that there have been some cosmetic changes. But if you look at the 1943 Act and the changes that we had in different parts of the years, 1969, 2004, there were more or less cosmetic changes. It's only in 2020 that we have a new act. So that kind of gives you an idea of the kind of police force we have. The police force in Nigeria is a very powerful institution headed by the Inspector General of Police. Interestingly, also, we've had different commissions of inquiry set up to look into issues of police brutality, and they've all submitted reports. The unfortunate thing really is that most times there's no political will to implement those reports. And clearly, like you had in the CNN report, the Special Anti-Robbery Squad has been banned by government 4 times. And you will wonder how they managed to resurrect after the official banning by the federal government. So a combination of things actually happened. There have been several protests against the anti-robbery squad. The way they operate, although initially they were set up in 1992, and the responsibility was actually to tackle armed robbery, which was highly rising at that particular point in time. But over the years, the SARS unit actually moved away from what they were supposed to do. The Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria recognizes that you're innocent until proven guilty by a court of competent jurisdiction. So ordinarily, when you are arrested, of course, you're supposed to be told your crime, and then you're supposed to be taken to a police custody, to a police station in order for you to make a statement. But what happens is that in Nigeria, there's this issue of profiling. So if you're a young man, probably of my age or younger, and you have a tattoo on your body, or you have a dreadlock, or unfortunately you have an iPhone, or you're seen with a laptop, it is assumed that you're a criminal and that you have to prove your innocence. And proving your innocence will include patterns with some amount of money. It could also result in your death. So a lot of young Nigerians, unfortunately, have died because of police brutality, not because they are criminals, but because they were profiled and probably they didn't have any money, or maybe one thing led to the other and they got killed. And there are different cases of police extrajudicial killing that has taken place in different parts of the country and still counting. So sometime this year, of course, we all know the COVID pandemic, a lot of youths lost their jobs. Currently, the Academic Staff Union of Universities is on strike. So most students are on strike except the private schools. So it was actually a charged atmosphere. Of course, also, if you look at the National Security Strategy 2019, it rightly pointed out that we have 63% of the population at young people, and that there's a high level of unemployment, and that if government does not do anything actually to give opportunity to young Nigerians, that there's a possibility of having issues. So what happened in Nigeria was actually predicted. The National Security Strategy and other policy papers have actually said that there could be problems, and also with the pandemic that rendered a lot of people jobless and made a lot of people unnecessarily vulnerable to the economic conditions of the country. So a young man was extrajudicially killed in Nigeria, and then the protest started. One of the key things about the 2020 protest is that it was well organized. There was no known leader, and they used social media to actually organize effectively. And of course, most times after the protest, they will still clean up the places where they stayed and protested and move on. So what happened is at that point in time, government introduced the individuals we call thugs who now came to disrupt these protests. Unfortunately, some of the protesters were actually killed by political thugs who, of course, we saw people driving in big cars, of course, unmarked cars. And most times when you see those cars, you realize that basically they are from government agencies. Then after that, we now had the Lekki, what happened in Lekki, where about 12 people were killed according to Amnesty International. The federal government is still questioning the reliability of that information. But of course, from what CNN rightly pointed out, there is evidence to show that Nigerians died. Some people were yet to see them even as we speak. So that now galvanized what we can call the third phase of the rioting, where individuals who were not actually part of the original now took over the streets. A lot of people were killed, including police officers. Houses were burned, government offices were burned, and invariably, it was more or less a mayhem. And there were several destructions in police offices and all those things. One of the key things, actually, that the protesters had requested for is what we call 5 for 5, the demands. And the demands are very simple. One is the immediate release of all protesters. The second one is justice for some victims and compensation for their families of those who died. The third one is setting up of panels of inquiry, which government has done now in different parts of the country. The fourth one is, according to the new Police Act, there is need for psychological evaluation of police officers. So the protesters requested that these police officers, who are members of the defunct Special Anti-Robbery Squad, popularly called SARS, should undergo psychological evaluation before they are integrated into the police. And finally, the protesters also asked that there should be an increase in the salary of police officers so that they're able to do their job. Generally, a lot of Nigerians, even police officers, retired police officers who spoke to during that period, identified with what they were saying. And there was also the issue of not just police reform, but also the issue of governance. And so you see it that the protest was not just only about police reform, but it was generally also about issues of democracy, issues of rule of law, issues of political will, and issues of governance in Nigeria. And so what is happening now is that the panels of inquiry have started sitting in different parts of the country, including Abuja. But most of the people who protested are not very comfortable, especially with the composition of those panels of inquiry and what is happening there, because they still feel that government has not really come clean in terms of the necessary changes that need to be done for us to be assured that they have been listened to. Another thing also is that there's a crackdown actually on protesters. So those people who are identified with the protesters, either on social media or other on television or radio, there is kind of pushback from the government. Some of them have tried to travel and their passports were seized, and there are some people who are arrested and they spent some days in detention. The reality also is that, as I conclude, is that in 2012, the CLEEN Foundation did a public hearing on police reform generally. And that report also accompanied other reports from different panels of inquiry, which was submitted to government. And not much actually has been done. And also in 2018, we had collaborated with the National Human Rights Commission to set up a panel of inquiry to look at issues of police brutality, especially for this SARS. And then government also set up another panel of inquiry. It's just as the SARS protests were taken up that the white paper was released. So the National Human Rights Commission is currently at the process of looking at how to implement that. One of the key problems we have with the Nigerian police force is a police service commission that actually has oversight is crippled in terms of ability to manage the powers that has been given to them. So it seems actually that everybody relies on the Inspector General of Police actually to ensure that there is discipline. And of course, there's also this issue of who recruits police officers, the process of recruitment, punishment, and the rest of it. So for me, the SARS protest was actually a clarion call for Nigeria to look closely again at the issue of youth engagement, at the issue of democracy, and also the issue of participation. And we are hoping that this will actually mark the beginning of a long journey of police reform in Nigeria. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Olugbuo, for giving us this context for SARS. Next, we have Professor Onwu.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening, good morning. Thank you so much, Linda, as well as Professor Barbaye for having me here this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to start with a quote by Maya Angelou, and she said, "I have great respect for the past. If you don't know where you've come from, you don't know where you're going. I have respect for the past, but I'm a person of the moment. I'm here and I do my best to be completely centered at the place I'm at. Then I go forward to the next place." This quote is, provides us with context, as to why we're here, and essentially, will guide us toward this conversation. As a Cameroonian, immigrant myself, working at the Commission on Human Rights, it was very important, for me, to find a space to be able to advocate for the African diaspora in New York City. That was a community that has been underserved, for a very long time in city government. And so in order for me to be able to do this, I knew that research was very important. And so without the numbers, without the statistics, it would be very difficult, for us to be able to advocate, for individuals in the African diaspora, for Nigerians, for Ghanaians, for Kenyans. And according to the Pew Research Center, there were 2.1 million African immigrants living in the United States in 2015. That number was up from 881,000 in 2000. So that is a substantial increase from the 1970s. And so when we compare that with other major groups who have arrived in the US in the past 5 years, the Pew Research essentially states that Africans had the fastest growth rate from 2000 to 2013, right? Increasing by about 41% during that specific period. And we do know that African immigrants in the US are more likely to settle in the South, in the Northwest, in the Midwest, as well as in the West, right? And New York City, boasts of a very large, amount of immigrants, especially, from the continent, right? So 1 in 3, Africans in New York City are foreign born. And then as of 2015, the 5 top countries of birth for foreign born Africans in New York were Nigerians, Ghanaians, Ethiopians, Egyptians, as well as Kenyans. We do know that New York City has about 145,000 immigrants who are born in Africa, and this number has increased tremendously over the years. So I say all of that to say that Africans, like many other immigrants, have come to the US to stay. They have slowly found ways to integrate within the US system. And so as the New York City Commissioner of Human Rights, as the lead for the African diaspora, so a lot of my work has to do with engaging the African diaspora, throughout the 5 boroughs. And so I do this, by reaching out to the community, to hear about the issues, the concerns, and take it back to City Hall, to figure out ways in which we can, mobilize the community. And we have done this over the past 4 years, through conversations, through programming, through town halls, through several discussions with other community-based organizations. The New York City Commission on Human Rights, for most of you who are not aware, is one of the most comprehensive anti-discrimination law in the entire nation. We have 27 protected classes. So essentially, you cannot face discrimination because of your race, because of your color, either perceived or actual. And also, we have 5 different areas that we focus on. So we have discrimination in employment, discrimination in housing, public accommodation, bias-based profiling by law enforcement, which is what I'm going to be focusing on today for the purpose of this conversation, as well as discriminatory harassment. So essentially, New Yorkers, essentially have a 1-year statute of limitation to file a complaint with our office. We have about 4 different bureaus. So we have the Community Relations Bureau, which is the bureau where I am actually working in. So our job is to educate New Yorkers about your rights, because I do understand that as a Cameroonian myself, growing up in Cameroon, right, the city government, or the police unit was not always, an institution where, we can turn to if we needed help, right? And so, but then when you come to the US, you realize that yes, these institutions, are not perfect, but at least, to be able to be in a position where you're advocating for your community, where you're telling individuals, as a city, worker, we are here to help you, right? So if you have any issues, any concerns, you have to come to us. And so that's exactly what we do within the Community Relations Bureau. We also have a law enforcement bureau where individuals can file complaints of discrimination, right? And the most important thing I would say is that, in the office, we speak over 30 different languages. And so knowing that New York City is very diverse, with myriad, of different immigrants from all over the globe. So, it is essential, for African immigrants to feel safe, to feel comfortable to be able to reach out to the office, in the event, in which they face discrimination. And some of the issues and some of the concerns, that have come up a lot within the African diaspora, the Nigerian community, specifically is that, oftentimes, individuals feel this, are victims of discrimination at work, right? Because of their accent, just like mine. I have a French accent. And so oftentimes, when you have, this accent, you might be treated, differently. Or because, you are from a specific nation on the continent. But then in the aspect of bias-based profiling by law enforcement, right? So essentially this occurs when police or peace officers target you or arrest you other than because of your criminal law enforcement or actions, right? So there need not be specific information linking you to unlawful activity, but essentially this might occur, either because someone perceives you, or because of an actual threat. And so, as a Commissioner of Human Rights, we do take on those cases, and as I mentioned earlier, we do have a law enforcement bureau, that essentially prosecutes those cases. But unfortunately, we, have not had a lot of those cases come to us, and so, we continue, to provide education, to community members, in the hope that, they will reach out to us, whenever they face, any instance of discrimination. And as I mentioned earlier, some of the issues, that have come up again, with the African diaspora is that people don't feel safe reaching out, to report any form of discrimination, when it has to do with the law enforcement agency, because of our experiences, back home, because we don't trust, the police, and so why should I, reach out, to a police agency, to file a complaint? And so we are constantly, like working and, and reaching out to different, community organizations and speaking to them one-on-one, in the hopes that, this narrative will essentially change. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Onwu, for really contextualizing the concerns of the Nigerian and African diaspora in New York City. Next, we have Shyvana Newsom of Black Lives Matter, Greater New York.
Thank you so much for having me. It's truly an honor to be here with my fellow panelists, and also our Director of Operations at Black Lives Matter Greater New York is a very, very proud John Jay graduate. So please continue pumping out great and brilliant, beautiful minds. When we talk about police brutality, we have to, I can speak for a start here in America, the Fugitive Slave Act, when officers were created to take people who look like me and bring them back to plantations. We have to think about the history of policing in America. It is absolutely about the enforcement of white supremacy. We see the disparities in the criminal justice system, and we see it in every aspect of our life. This is nothing more than systemic oppression. And right now, we are living in the largest civil rights movement ever, with the unfortunate and martyrdom of the good brother George Floyd. We've seen protests erupt around the world. So I am not surprised about Nigeria, about SARS, because we've received calls out of Australia, out of Denmark. As recently as this week, we've seen the video footage of the things that were happening in Paris, how we've seen a young Black man being beaten by a police force. Police do this because they can, and laws protect them and allow them to do this. This is why people were calling for the defunding of police departments. As you heard my fellow panelists talk about how SARS was broken up and dismantled and given another name 4 different times, if we don't reimagine policing and think about public safety and investing in our communities, but policing just will not work. Over 400 years since its creation, we see how police treat people who have melanin in their skin, how they treat Black people, how they oppress people. So we need to invest in communities. We need lawmakers. We need people from our community to go on and run for office, because with the unrest that came from George Floyd, it allowed our organization to get 4 laws passed here in New York State that wouldn't have happened if there was no unrest. Because people often ask, why do we protest? Why are you shutting down the George Washington Bridge? Why are you taking your body and shutting down the FDR Highway? These are New York things. It's a very big bridge, a very big highway for our international viewers. They're major points. And the reason why we do this, one, we use the media to spread our message, but we shame politicians into doing their job. Every time you see an activist in a newspaper, you see a protest happen, then you start getting calls from governors. You start getting calls from senators who want to change laws. This is why we do this. But one thing we realize at Black Lives Matter Greater New York is We need laws to protect us. The same way we need laws to hold police accountable. So we need to continue to push forward with that. And that's what we do at Black Lives Matter Greater New York with the inception of Black Lives Caucus, where we endorse political candidates. We were the first organization to get behind AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But in the interim, while we're applying pressure to politicians, we must take care of ourselves. We must, Black people, around the world, around the whole diaspora, we need to do community aid. We need to help each other. We need to understand that areas that have the highest rate of crime have the highest rates of unemployment. We need to understand what's troubling our people and work until the government wants to do something about it. And so not only are we pushing for laws at Black Lives Matter Greater New York, we're in the process of buying 50 acres of land in Atlanta to teach Black people how to farm and take care of themselves, because we see systemic oppression in our healthcare. And that's why our people can't beat the coronavirus. They can't beat COVID-19. But at the same time, simultaneously in the Bronx, we're teaching job skills. We fed 6,000 people. So I want people to know that activism and restoring Black people, police brutality is terrible. Let's be real. You're in danger of getting pulled over on the streets. You're in danger of them knocking down your door and being shot in your bed if you are a Black woman, say her name, Breonna Taylor. But our mission is about the full liberation of Black people. And that's why we work with international groups. That's why we push forward and mobilize for change. That's why we walked voters to the polls with rifles in Georgia to turn that state blue. And these are our aims and goals, the full liberation of Black people, because yes, police brutality does get a lot of attention, but when Bronx kids have an asthma rate 8 times that of New York City, that's also important. When the Bronx became the epicenter of the corona rate, because we know what people make in terms of finances, we know what education level they've reached. These are all things that are super important and what we must continue to fight for. I'm happy that police brutality, unfortunately, it allows us to change laws. It takes a martyr. It takes someone dying for the world to truly change. So to the Nigerians who lost their lives in Africa, to George Floyd, to Breonna Taylor, we needed them to foster real change, but we can't stop there. We have to keep pushing, and this is a life's mission. So that's pretty much the gist of what we do. We feed people, we fight for people. Anytime a Black person is being taken advantage of around this world or being marginalized and murdered, Black Lives Matter Greater New York will continue to stand up and fight for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Shyvana Newsom. And I see here a lot of connections with Professor Browne-Marshall's opening statements about what it means to reimagine policing and what is needed, what needs to be included in that kind of effort. So thank you very much.
I was nodding the whole time Professor Marshall was speaking. I was like, preach on it, preach on it. I was very excited to follow behind you.
Next, we have Ajim DK, a human rights activist, and joining us on the faculty at John Jay in the spring.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And you know, Shavonna was just talking about COVID. We're all working at home and I have construction right next to me. So I hope you don't hear any background noise, but I've been moving around the place. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. And this is a topic that's especially close to my heart. You know, when I saw the end of SARS, I watched it online like so many people. I was in awe of the discipline, of the commitment, the dedication, the organization that Benson just referenced. And I was equally infuriated by the police violence, that the government, state violence that we witnessed. In many ways, it's really deflating to me to see history repeat itself. I grew up in Nigeria when there were several military regimes, including one led by the current President Buhari. And then, as now, government has always responded to people expressing their human right to expression, or realizing, taking full advantage of their human right to freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, government has often responded with violence. They did so in the 80s, and they continue to do so. I saw similar violent government reaction to protests in 2014, which many of you remember, especially Shyvana, I'm sure, after the murder of Michael Brown by Darren Wilson. I happened at the time to be in Geneva with the mother of Trayvon Martin, Sabrina Fulton, and the father of Jordan Davis, both grieving parents who had lost their kids to state-enabled gun violence. And we watched as in St. Louis, police responded to protests again with militarized violence, showcasing the array of weapons that they had gotten over the years from government. Later that year, that same year, we went back to Geneva with Michael Brown's parents, as well as the relatives of others who had lost their loved ones to state violence. That work was facilitated by my former organization, the U.S. Human Rights Network, in partnership with Jamil at the ACLU. So why was it important for groups? Why was it important for us to use the human rights framework? That's what I want to talk about in my time today. Because I think it's relevant for what's happening, what continues to happen in the US and what is also happening in Nigeria. First, the standards in international human rights law, which both countries have ratified, are higher than we typically have in our national laws. The second is that it often provides an avenue for us to seek justice when our domestic remedies fail, which our domestic remedies often fail, as we've seen. And then the third is that if we do it strategically, we can put an international spotlight and pressure on governments and make it more difficult for them to continue human rights abuses. So let me talk briefly about the higher standards, just as a few examples. The International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which is a human rights treaty on eliminating racial discrimination, is one that we've used a lot in the United States with communities directly impacted by human rights abuses. It defines discrimination as any practice or policy that has a disproportionate negative impact on people based on their race. So for example, something like cash bail would automatically be defined as discriminatory under international human rights law because it disproportionately impacts low-income communities of color, and in particular, Black and Latinx communities, where higher bail amounts are often set for the same offenses as with that white people commit. The other thing that I wanted to highlight, or protection under international law that I thought it's important to highlight here, is that everyone has the right to effective protection and remedies from a competent court. Now, that might seem obvious, but as we have just heard, it is in fact not the case that victims of state violence, and I think of state violence in a broad way, but victims of state violence, murders perpetrated, in this case, perpetrated by law enforcement, rarely get justice. In fact, in the United States, about 1,000 people are killed by law enforcement every year. Yet in the past 5 years, we haven't had over 120, I think it's 122 people who have law enforcement officials who have actually been arrested and charged with a crime. And of those, less than half have been convicted, and it's often for a lesser crime. So what is the point here? The point is that we have higher standards that are international law that we should be accessing, that we should be using to reframe the discussion, especially when we're talking about policing, which, as we've heard, was never designed to ensure the safety of people of color or of people who don't have power within communities, which is what happens in the case in Nigeria. There's rampant insecurity everywhere, yet SARS targets people who don't have political or economic power in the community and ignores vast cases of insecurity happening throughout the country, including one that just happened yesterday. So it gives us an opportunity to reframe and to reimagine what safety could really look like based on human rights. Two other points real quick is that I said it gives us a platform when domestic remedies fail. One thing that I think is important to note is that human rights mechanisms offer us a way to submit reports and to document human rights violations. In the United States, one of the only places we have a collective documented cases of sexual violence perpetrated by police against women, particularly Black and trans women, is in shadow reports that have been submitted to the United Nations. Then the final thing, and I think this is really relevant now, especially for what's happening in Nigeria, which, as we heard Benson say, they're still targeting protesters, is that it helps us shine an international spotlight on what's happening, on government action or inaction, because we all know that silence, opacity, procrastination, these are all the friends of human rights abusers. So in this case, by using the different treaty reporting mechanisms that are available, by calling on special experts, special mandate holders at the United Nations to continue to issue reports on the situation, we can continually have attention being paid to what's happening in Nigeria. And the same for the United States. It's been used successfully in places like Chicago that have gotten to a point where they now have reparations for victims and families of people who were tortured by a former Chicago police detective. Let me close up because I know we want to get to discussions, is that the human rights framework, and you'll hear a little bit more from Jamil, it's not a silver bullet, but it can be used effectively to put pressure on governments, and it should be used as one of the tools that we use in this fight for justice. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor DK, for introducing us to how the UN human rights framework might apply to this context. Next, we'll go over to Professor Dakwar, who is the director of the ACLU Human Rights Program, to also add to this discussion about the UN human rights framework.
Thank you so much for the organizers. It's really an honor to be with friends and colleagues and to share some additional comments on what we're seeing today. This global movement that's really inspired by Black Lives Matter movement in the United States that has gone now internationally, all the way to connecting with the struggles like the people in Nigeria, as we heard earlier. So our role has been as an organization that supports everyone's human rights is that to be there for the people's rights, whether they are the rights to protest, whether there's a right to equal protection, equality before the law, and particularly getting their human dignity respected, which is something that particularly people of African descent in the United States have been denied for so many years, as we've heard. So what I wanted to say in a few minutes that I have is just to give you an update where we are in this movement demanding accountability for police violence and demanding ending structural racism. I think that what we saw over the summer, again, because of the protests, because of after the horrific murder of George Floyd and other Black men and women, it was another wave of protest that I think this time people realized that they can't really, they had enough. And it was really important to stress that not just nationwide in the United States, but it had echoed internationally. So as mentioned, and as AJ mentioned earlier, we were looking at ways to support the movement and provide international accountability, because the United States historically has always called on other countries to uphold international human rights, to uphold their obligations under international law. And yet when it comes to the United States, we always found a way, in the United States found a way to exempt itself from domestic applications of these human rights standards, particularly when it comes to Black people in America. And in fact, there's a long history of the United States rejecting and pushing back against full participation in the international human rights system because of the fear that it will have an impact on its history of Jim Crow laws, segregation, particularly in the South. And I'm talking about the era of the beginning of the United Nations in the mid 1940s, late 1940s and the 50s, after the adoption of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And so we've seen over and over the years attempts by leaders and civil rights organizations in the Black community going to the United Nations and calling out the United States for its failure to uphold their human rights. And yet there's always been a way to get away with that accountability. And I think this past summer, we saw something different. We saw not only that organizations calling for such accountability to happen in a most effective way, that is not just a condemnation in the sort of statements which are good and important to be made by both the United Nations human rights experts, mechanisms, and also countries, but it was a call for independent commission of inquiry, which has never really been the call or the ask, at least in a modern history, looking specifically at the history of extrajudicial killings of Black people in the United States. And that call was led by families of victims of police violence in the United States. It was supported by hundreds of civil society organizations from all over the world, not just from the United States. And as a result of that request, calling on the Human Rights Council in Geneva to convene a special session and to create independent commission of inquiry by experts who have the experience of investigating such crimes and lead to change, as we see in many parts of the world where human rights crises erupt. We demanded equal treatment of the United States. And we also called on the same investigation to look at the way that the United States government at the federal, state, and local level detained, arrested, and violently suppressed protesters, particularly in the context of Black Lives Matter protests. 54 nations, all of Africa as a continent, as the so-called Africa group within the United Nations, supported the demand to hold a special session. And in fact, proposed a resolution that would create a commission of inquiry, independent one. And that is unprecedented. That has happened because of the call of protesters, because of the movement for Black lives in the United States. And then unfortunately, because of US pressure, its allies, that's not something new, we're used to it. The draft resolution was watered down. It excluded mention of the United States. It took out the call or the demand to establish a commission of inquiry and instead only called for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to examine racist police violence against people of African descent, and not just in the United States, but in other parts of the world, make it more global thematic report, which is in of itself is an important endeavor. It's an important step forward, because as we heard from our colleagues in Nigeria and elsewhere, this is not a US problem. The US problem has been going on for way too long, and it has a specific characteristics or unique situation because of the way that the United States presents itself, because of the way that there is a promise that we have an independent judiciary, that we have an independent investigation, and so on. But that is a global phenomenon. But yet we are determined to turn this beginning of accountability, this is just the first step, into something that will echo the call for police accountability in the United States, which is now gone beyond the traditional call for police reforms. As you heard from earlier speakers, it's not anymore about let's just get body cameras, let's just get more training on implicit bias, let's get more independent oversight boards, civilian oversight board, etc. These are all things that when demanded, in some places they were even instituted, and yet they were not enough. And so that's why I think the movement, Black Lives Matter movement, and supported by many organizations, and I'm really happy that the ACLU is one of the organizations supporting the demands for reimagining policing. That is to reinvest in communities, as you heard from Shyvana. That is to say, we should be questioning the idea that police departments should be afforded millions, and in fact, in the New York NYPD case, more than $1 billion in budget. And yet, at the same time, we see decreases in essential funding to certain particular services that are essential. Let's reinvest in life-affirming alternatives to the police departments and the way that's, and that requires a little bit of imagination, but it also requires a constant pressure. That doesn't mean that we're going to get it overnight. I think the idea is we continue to pressure on the federal level to have a national standards for the use of force, which we don't have, to end the qualified immunity, which prevented victims from getting effective remedy and access to justice. We need to make sure that we end the militarization of policing. The fact that the Department of Defense and the Pentagon provides our local law enforcement with weapons that are used in armed conflict situations, that should be stopped. We should be also making sure that we support people who are in crisis, particularly mental health crisis. We've seen over and over again cases of people, instead of getting the support that they need and the attention of professionals, they're getting police departments and police officers showing their guns and shooting them, sometimes fatally shooting them, sometimes injuring them very seriously. So we have to do all of those things while at the same time pushing for these changes on the state and local level. And I think the international push for eliminating, dismantling racial discrimination and structural racism is not just in the context of policing. It has to be seen in the broader context of the lack of full enjoyment of social and economic rights, particularly for people of African descent in this country. It's only then when you will be able to see the whole picture, because the police is one instrument, it's one tool that the government has been using in order to, historically, as you heard from other panelists, as it historically was one that's used in order to oppress Black people, whether it's as a slave patrol, or whether they were suppressing protests during the civil rights era, etc., and more recently in the so-called war on drugs. So all of these things had to end. And finally, I think one of the important calls that we are making is to connect the conversation that we're having about dismantling structural racism, particularly racist police violence, to the call for reparations. There's now a call, or we've heard that during the United States periodic review, there's a universal periodic review at the United Nations just 2 weeks ago, when country after country has called for the US to end police violence. But they also called for looking at the history of racial discrimination and reckoning with the history of slavery in this country. And that is why it's important to support the demands of the people and the organizations that for many years have been calling for reparations, the reparation movement, and to put it in and center it in the conversation about radical change and reimagining of policing in a democratic society. Because only when we are able to do that, look at the history and repair the damage and the wrongs that happen, only then we will be able to move forward in a way that will be able to protect people's rights and humanity on an equal footing. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, panelists. Audience, I didn't lie. I said you were in for a real treat. As you can see here, we have a very powerful discussion about end SARS in Nigeria and Black Lives Matter movement in the US, as well as this global context for policing and reimagining policing. I want to get into a little bit of that discussion before we can move on to the Q&A. I see a couple of questions are coming in. But specifically, if we're talking about this global effort and two nations for this discussion, what are some of the similarities and differences that you can distill for the audience between these contexts? Because I think the next kind of logical question for this, since we are talking about people leading and movements and speaking specifically to young people who are interested in leading in these movements, what can you learn from each other or from both situations? So if you could please, anyone of the panelists, distill for us some of the similarities and the differences, and what can activists learn from each other, whether in Nigeria or the United States, about a global effort?
May I just jump in for?
Absolutely.
I want to two things. First, to start off, in my graduate studies, I spent time at University of Ibadan in Nigeria, but I also presented an intervention before the United Nations in Geneva in the late 90s on racial discrimination and criminal injustice. The reason why I raised this is because in my book, the last chapter is Race and Internationalism. People of African descent have been presenting the issue of racial discrimination, lynching, torture, Jim Crow segregation before an international body for well over 150 years. And so whether or not that was Ida B. Wells Barnett as an activist presenting lynching and in international bodies, Marcus Garvey presenting it with the League of Nations, W.B. Du Bois presenting this before the United Nations, we have been talking about these issues because it's a mixture of law and violence. And I think the commonality is it's government sanctioned murder, government sanctioned assault. So even if we add people of African descent to a police department, even if we add Black prosecutors and Black judges, if the laws themselves are still bent on colonialistic viewpoints or bent on the Jim Crow segregationist viewpoint, then you're still going to end up with the same result. And that's why the litigation, legislation, and protest, I say, are the three trifecta of sorts necessary for social change. You always have to have litigation challenging the laws that are in place and legislation demanding the repeal of these old laws and then reinstituting or instituting new ones, and protests putting the pressure on, as was previously stated, to make it happen. And that is a global effect that we need to all understand, that if we just keep the same laws and just shift out the different people, you're going to end up with the same results. And this is what I think has been missed so often. The idea that it's the government doing this. When they say, well, what about Black on Black crime? Or in Nigeria, well, what about youth on youth crime? But those individual crimes, as people know, happen whether or not it's white on white crime or Asian on Asian crime. But when it's government sanctioned, those bullets we paid for out of our tax money, the uniform and the power they have, we supposedly gave them. So that's why we have to look at the difference between the government assault on our rights and the fact that even when you bring in good police officers into a bad system, you still end up with a bad result.
Thank you.
Yeah. For me, all animals are equal and some animals are more equal than others. So what happens in Nigeria is more or less police brutality on vulnerable groups. Young people who are poor relatively. And the argument normally when they meet you on the checkpoint is that a young boy of your age cannot be holding an iPhone, or you cannot be riding a good car, or wearing a dreadlock means that you're into crime, or wearing a tattoo on your body means that you're into crime. So there's this element of profiling. But what we also see in terms of similarity is the power of social media, because young people have managed to use social media to organize. The SARS protest was highly organized. And I mean, everybody, gave kudos to the young people who organized it, and there was no leadership. So you couldn't say this is the leader or this is the person who was directly responsible. And of course, it also fed into the issue of COVID-19 pandemic. At the early stages of COVID lockdown in Nigeria, we had more deaths from police brutality than the virus itself. It was after a month that, of course, the numbers from the pandemic now started rising more than. There were young men who died because they were not wearing face masks. There were people in some places, reports we got, is that people actually had to wear face masks, not because of the virus, but actually because of police brutality. So you see also that the pandemic has actually made it difficult for young people because they've lost employment. So there's this level of vulnerability. And of course, the police officers, they know the people, the rich people among us. They don't touch those ones. It's only the young, poor people who don't have access to money, who are disenfranchised, and who don't have access to means of livelihood that's actually at the receiving end. So if your family is rich and you can afford big lawyers, nobody will want to touch you. If you're a son or daughter of a politician, nobody will go against you. But if you're a young man on the street and they know that there is nothing you can do, and some people have actually, some police officers unfortunately have told people, I will kill you and nothing will happen. It's actually a usual phrase in Nigeria. So there's that understanding that police brutality is meted out at individuals who are at the lowest ebb of the society.
Just to jump in on your question, it's just a simple sentence. Organized people defeat organized power. So when the youth came together and they began to organize and use all their resources from social media to press to strategy, because that's what good activism is, it's strategy. You have a list of demands, you have a goal. As much as we're frustrated and we're yelling, it's always a purpose to it. So by working together, by using your network, by being resilient, I truly believe, even though we see so many negative things, it's been like this for 400 years for Black people, I am wholly optimistic. So by working together and staying organized, I think it's easy for us to take down a government, to take down a system, because we empower these people, as Professor Marshall was saying. We created these people, we give them money, we supply them, and we fund them. So we have to know is to remember our power. I think that will actually be the first step before getting organized. As somewhere along the line, poor people, especially Black people, we've forgotten how royal and how powerful we are. And that's the most dangerous thing to a corrupt system, is people knowing, when you see with George Floyd, that we don't have to take it. Yeah, I can be beaten with your batons, I can be thrown in jail. We always say you can jail a revolutionary, but you can't jail a revolution. So remember that you're powerful, and then get organized. And I think any activist, no matter their age, they can win.
Thank you. There's a really great question from Emmanuel Maranrula in the audience about profiling and its importance for police officers. How would you tackle, how can we use this reimagining of policing to tackle structural racism? Jamil, please, Professor Dakwar, jump in.
Thank you. I think it's a great question because, you know, the issue of racial profiling is an example of how the system is set up to really control people, and particularly built around the idea of criminalization. And I think that there should be one of the things of trying to really get change the structures is that to decriminalize a lot of the activities that the police uses in order to enforce the laws and then criminalize people and then get them into the criminal legal system. And that's what a lot of the people who are incarcerated, particularly in the United States, are a result of these laws that are really, whether it's the so-called war on drugs, which is a really racist campaign of enforcing drug laws, whether it's the way that the laws evolved, and in order to, and the way that now Black people are being seen as people who should be controlled, and should be contained, and should be over-policed. So I think racial profiling is one major problem that we've been having in this country for so many years. We've been tracking this for a long time at the ACLU and many other organizations. In fact, I was looking back because we were preparing now a submission to the UN on this, and we're looking at the fact that we don't have a national law that prohibits the use of racial profiling. The End Racial Profiling Act, ERPA, has been reintroduced for, I think, nearly 20 years, every Congress. And yet there was also bipartisan support, by the way. Even the Bush administration, said they would be against racial profiling, and yet there was always these interest groups and powers that are particularly coming from a lot of the police interest groups, police unions, and others that are supporting the existing structures and making it more difficult to hold police accountable in those interactions between particularly people of color and the police. And we've seen that over and over again. It starts with a very small infraction, very small contact with the police, and it escalates because of police actions and because of police attitude towards individuals and communities. The Eric Garner situation is really, unfortunately, one of those examples, right, of seeing someone who would be targeted for selling cigarettes outside. And then that in of itself is not addressed. We are only looking at, yes, it's important to look at individual accountability for police officers, and Eric Garner's killers have not been held accountable. But it's important to look at the broader system where we criminalize people who are with mental health, we criminalize people who are homeless, we criminalize people who are just doing, sometimes just going by as say Black people walking around, and that's not just, by the way, police officers and law enforcement. It's happening also where you have white vigilante groups doing that, and we saw how many people were killed extrajudicially because of these groups or people who thought that they have the privilege and they have the protection of the law, the immunity to be able to use, stand your ground laws, for example, in order to use force against people who did not do any harm to them. So I think issue of racial profiling, collecting data on that, making sure that there's no incentives to police departments, and the police department should not be in any way given any grants, federal grants. There should be really a concerted effort in order to address that problem nationally, statewide, and locally. I think the Breathe Act that was presented to Congress by the Movement for Black Lives offers those kind of comprehensive answers. I think we need to look at those kind of answers rather than thinking only about the old traditional way of, we just have to, it's only about a few bad apples. No, it's not about a few bad apples. It's about really a whole system that is conceived of as being based or built upon the idea that certain people have lesser rights in the context of
and yet I think this ties in with one of the questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to riff a little bit off of Natalie Massimi's question about abolition. In this global context, we're seeing some similarities, some comparisons here. Why reform and not abolition? Why reimagine and not abandon?
I completely believe in abolition. It's just, as we saw with the elections and people voting down the ballot, Americans didn't quite understand or chose not to understand what defunding the police meant. So when I say reimagine the police, I'm actually reimagining a world without police. I am reimagining social workers in our schools. I'm reimagining job training. I'm reimagining skilled people to handle the things that police can't. You can't reform a broken system. You can't do patchwork on hundreds of years of damage and systemic oppression. But I'm choosing my words and my messaging a certain way so people who choose not to understand and do their research, so they can get it, so the world can get it, because defund was too scary. People couldn't understand that that was a long-term process and reinvestment in the community. So I'm trying to find the nicest word as possible to say, abolish the damn police. Yeah.
Let me jump in here, Dara, because this has been something that's been on my mind a lot as well. I think I agree with Shyvana. When I say reimagine, I'm thinking really about reimagining what we need in our societies to be safe. And that people have talked about, we need jobs, we need to be able, we need shelter, we need homes that are safe, we need education, we need a whole range of things in order to be safe in our societies. And we often we have developed systems that rely on law enforcement to address the fact that we have underinvested in our social needs in society. So I think that's when I say we need to reimagine, that's also what I am talking about. What's interesting is that we started talking about profiling just to make connections. Gloria and Benson both mentioned the origins of policing in the United States and in Nigeria. The police system was not created to ensure that communities of color or communities who don't have power are safe. And so we do need to realistically, when we would need to imagine what we would like to build as we break down what we currently have. But we have to have a solution. And I think that that's where we should be spending our time, is imagining what is it exactly that we need in order to, for everyone to be safe. And let's also talk about the fact that I meant to mention, we also need to talk about what women need to be safe, because we talk often about police violence, yet one of the most frequent act of violence committed against women in the United States, and probably even in Nigeria, if one looked at the data, is sexual violence. And that's also not talked about. But in any case, to answer that question, I do think that we need a cultural shift. The reason that we have the kind of violence perpetrated today is that we've normalized profiling. We've normalized it in the United States. It's normalized in Nigeria, as we've heard.
Thank you very much. I see that there are two comments in the Q&A, one from Faisal Umar and the other from Khadija Yakubu, that tie nicely together, that I'd just like to bring together as we're coming to the end of this discussion. Khadija points out that with End SARS protests, there was no leadership that could be singled out. And she mentions Ken Saro-Wiwa and company, who were, of course, as we know, killed. And that this shift of not having leaders who could be singled out is evidence of what has been learned in terms of learning from the past. But at the same time, Faisal asks the question, how far can protests really change things in a country like Nigeria, where different interests can hijack protests? What are your thoughts about this? I'd love to hear, of course, from Dr. Benson and Christelle and Ajim, especially, because I think there's a good question here about the role of the Nigerian diaspora and how that might factor in, as well as what lessons are learned and what the future is for Nigeria in relation to End SARS. I'll actually throw that out there for anyone who wants to comment, but I'm just pointing specifically to you three because of the where we started in the discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Even though there was more or less no known leader, of course, we also know that celebrities actually played a very important role in that. And so these are the ones that government is going against. Of course, there's this push now to regulate social media. We already have several laws already regulating social media. But government is pushing down on this narrative that there's misinformation, there's disinformation, there is fake news. We need to regulate social media. We need to ensure that they don't set Nigeria on fire and all those things. So that's the other narrative. So what is happening also is that most of the celebrities that actually participated or supported or lent a helping hand are now being targeted, one thing or the other. Some people have been arrested. Some accounts have been frozen. Central Bank freezing people's accounts, arguing that they are involved in terrorist activities and different other very undemocratic tactics that is being used by government, actually questioning the legitimacy actually of the panels of inquiry that is being set up when government is also trying to pursue these vendetta-like activities against people who protested and whose protest is actually protected by the Nigerian Constitution. What has changed? Interestingly now, so some of the panels that have been set up, you will see that youths have been given a kind of a specific role to play. So for the panel in Lagos, you have 2 youths who are participating. And then in different programs and projects that government is organizing. So there's a dedicated tow line for youths now. So if they are doing a program and they are appointing about 10 people, you will see them trying to massage the ego of youth by saying, okay, we are reserving 2 slots for youths and all those things. So there's this consciousness, even though we all know that there is a problem of youth bulge, there's a problem of unemployment, somehow, suddenly, government is beginning to realize that youths form part of the equation of Nigeria. And the thing I want to end with is that this SARS protest is also looking at the general elections of 2023. So you will see youths now trying to organize and ask, how do we ensure that the leadership of 2023 takes into consideration the responsibilities of youth, it takes into consideration that we can take the charge of this country. So there have been some realignments. Of course, we know that the Independent National Electoral Commission is pushing for a review of the Electoral Act. So hopefully, probably, we hope that the 2023 general elections will be free and fair, and there will be more youth actually who want to get involved. So leadership, yes, government is pushing down. In terms of changes, there are some changes, but they are more cosmetic as we see them right now. We hope that something concrete will actually happen as we go forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Linda. Thank you so much for that question. As you know, my fellow panelists were speaking, I was thinking about, the issue of, it is great to have a law, it is great to pass policies, but oftentimes what happens with the implementation process, right? Oftentimes, we have beautiful laws, we have beautiful policies, but then, when it comes time to implement them on the ground, like we essentially, fell short. And so, that brings me, back, to the whole discussion of not having, a specific leader, lead the SARS movement, which essentially shows that, yes, we have learned from the past, and it is a beautiful thing, and it is, so important to see, the youth from the continent, rising up, and organizing it. And so how do I, compare it to what is happening here in New York City in the diaspora? So even, in terms of like organizing the African diaspora, it has been very challenging, right? Because again, if you think about the whole entire continent, we have 54 different nations. And so if I'm going to call myself the lead advisor of African communities, where do I even start? What communities, do I reach out to? And I personally feel as though, having a social work background has been so instrumental in the work that I do, because I'm able to meet people, where they are. And so in order for me to be able to do that, I had to learn that, there are people who have laid the foundation, before me, but I had to reinvent the wheel. And so when I started doing this work, I did not get a lot of support, from the elderly, who have, paved the way before me. So it was more of like, figuring out, how to build a coalition with different individuals from the diaspora, and not looking at it, from a Nigerian, Cameroonian, Kenyan perspective, but looking at it, as the African diaspora. And so, that was very, in a way challenging. But it also reminds me of the fact that even within the continent, oftentimes, when you, start a movement, oftentimes, young people, are not given that platform, to be able, to create change, because you have, the elders, telling us, well, we've done this before you, so, what makes you think that you can change, now? And so I have had to learn, for the past couple of, years, that oftentimes, I would say, the generation that has gone before us, should allow, the youth, to be creative. And I feel like the SARS movement has proven that, young people, are innovative, young people have great ideas, and they can create a coalition, they can come together. It doesn't matter if you're Igbo, if you're Yoruba, if you're from Edo State, it does not matter, because at the end of the day, we have a common goal. And so when, when we build a coalition, when we come together and speak as one, our voice, is larger, our voice is bigger. And that is what, I've been trying to do with that, with the African diaspora, the Nigerian diaspora here in New York City. Also, oftentimes when I put programming together, I have to tell myself, who is not at the table, right? So if I'm putting together an event with the Nigerian diaspora, I have to make sure that I have, a level of representation, from every state, right? Because if I don't, then, the narrative becomes, where you're favoring a specific ethnic group over the other. and so we constantly, have to, ask ourselves whenever we create tables, who is not at the table, and so who do we need to bring to that table to make sure that, that we have a bigger coalition.
I'll take 30 seconds and say there's a wonderful list in terms of the diaspora supporting. There's a wonderful list that a woman has pulled together. And her social media tag is Stay Marvelous, but it gives a lot of information and scripts on how the international community can continue to put pressure on elected officials in Nigeria and support them. I would say vice versa. Use the tools that we have, and the tools that a lot of us are using these days, some more than others, is social media, to lift up the struggles. I think that's really what supported SARS, is that you had a lot of celebrities, you had a lot of people, celebrities, not just Nigerian celebrities, but around the world, supporting what's happening. But we have violence happening everywhere. You have it happening in Uganda right now, just happened in France, videotaped beatings. So I guess what I'm saying is that we should really work this muscle of supporting each other and activism around the world, especially for African diasporas or other communities. I'll shout out Palestinians, as we have Jamil on the call, who have had similar histories and suffer similar oppression.
Thank you. Oh, I hate to end this because the discussion is really taking off, and I see some wonderful additional questions coming in, particularly around whether, from Palumi, about whether the UN really offers a good response for police brutality incidents, since they're often seen as a last resort. And that would have been a really great question to answer. And I see you nodding there, Professor Dakwar. Folks, I can't begin to thank you enough for this conversation. It has been rich and robust, and the time really flew by. I look forward to hearing more from you, as you are all clearly forces to reckon with, and you're so deeply engaged in this work. For those attendees out there, I hope you have seen that in order to look forward, we're also learning a lot from the past, learning a lot from each other, looking at comparative examples, but more specifically working in collaborative contexts. And this seems to be a common ground, regardless of the context on which the work of imagining, pushing for change and reform, or pushing for abolition, whatever the position is, collaborative, forward-thinking, organized, strategic work is necessary. I'd like to thank Dr. Barbara Ray, the director of the ICJ program, for organizing this event, co-sponsored by CLEEN Foundation, ACLU, Interdisciplinary Studies, Africana Studies Department, Political Science, Sociology, and Law, Police Science, and Criminal Justice Administration, in addition to the Center for Human Rights and the Center for Student Involvement and Leadership. It has been a wonderful hour and a half. Thank you so much for your participation. Last but not least, the Office for the Advancement of Research and Rachel Friedman, thank you so much for all of your work on this.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.